wanted to go over today a little bit of history of the firearm. I'm going to use this flintlock, this 50 caliber flintlock pistol, kind of as an example to take a look at the progression of firearm history from the hand cannon to what we're shooting in the Western Heritage Project. So in the very early development of the handgun, or the hand cannon they actually called it, one of the first firearms that you could actually hold and shoot yourself and use in a battle or any kind of a operation. It was basically just a barrel, and it looked kind of almost like a small cannon barrel. They weren't a whole lot longer than this, maybe another few inches longer than what's on this particular pistol, but they had a metal spike on the bottom, and you could hang onto that metal spike and balance that hand cannon in your hand. You'd have powder inside of it, you had a projectile inside of it, you'd have a little touch hole with a little bit of powder on the outside of it as well. And so the only way to get that to go off, the way black powder goes off, is with the flame. And so you'd have to take a flaming stick, hold this hand cannon with that spike sticking out the bottom, take a flaming stick and try to touch the touch hole to get that priming powder to go off, which would put fire into the barrel, and then the main powder charge would go off. And if you can imagine trying to aim at something and focus on your sights, or focus down the barrel, or focus on your target, there really weren't much for sights, but focus down at your target, and at the same time try to drop that flaming stick on there, you could see that as you're focusing back and forth and trying to get that stick, that you'd have a hard time being able to really hit anything. And so those early hand cannons were only there on a battlefield. This is the Middle Ages, really, that make a lot of noise, a lot of smoke, scare horses and that sort of thing. But you had to have fire with you in order to make this thing work. So if it was raining, it didn't work. If you weren't close to a fire where you could get a flaming stick or a red hot piece of steel, it wouldn't work. You always had to have flame. The next step is to put what they call the cock, which it looks like the head of a rooster, and so they started calling these things the cock. And you'd pull that hammer back, we call it the hammer today, and it would have a smoldering flame in it. And instead of having to have that flame on a stick, now you could have a little smoldering that they called the match. We would call it a wick, sort of. It was like a candle wick. And they call it the match, and they called the gun the matchlock. And so you'd have a pan with powder in it. As you squeeze the trigger, your hammer with that smoldering wick or that match in it would go down into that pan, set off that main powder charge, or that primer charge, which would set off the main powder charge and fire the projectile. This way, you weren't concentrating on your other hand trying to get a red hot piece of something up there. You could concentrate on the gun itself, you could concentrate on your target, and then you could squeeze off a shot and have that wick fall into the priming powder. Obviously it didn't work well when it was raining. It wasn't something you could sneak up on game with this smoldering wick. It did have a smell to it. It was hard to keep lit. It would burn back. If it kept it lit very long, it would burn back. You had to constantly be sliding more wick out the front. It was better than a stick with fire, but it wasn't perfect. So the next thing that came along was what they called the wheel lock. And this is where guns changed considerably, because having to have a flame with you either in the match or in the stick disappeared, and instead you had a flint. At the time it was iron pyrite, and you had a pan with powder, but you had a wheel right here, a little steel wheel on the side, and it was spring loaded. So you crank that wheel up, and then you would set your hammer down on the wheel, and when you pulled the trigger, that wheel would start to spin. And when that wheel would start to spin, it would rub on that iron pyrite and throw a bunch of sparks, and the spark would cause the fire instead of having to have a smoldering wick. And the lock time went down dramatically, because you would have the time it took from pulling the trigger to the gun going off was reduced incredibly. And that shower of sparks really set off that priming powder very, very quickly, put it into the barrel, and then you'd fire the projectile with the main powder charge. It spun a lot longer than it had to on those wheel locks, and you'd have to crank up your wheel every time you shot, and then it would just keep spinning a lot of times until the spring tension was gone. So the very next invention, and one that lasted almost 300 years, was the flintlock. And so instead of having a spinning wheel, it was discovered that all I need to make the powder, and that would be the pan, you put your priming powder in there, the only I need to have that to make that powder go off is some sparks off of a flint. So this gun is empty. I can pull the trigger, and hopefully, maybe not in the sunlight, but there are sparks that go down into the pan from the flint, sets the pan off, and a little bit better in wet weather. You can keep the powder somewhat dry. Didn't work great in wet weather, but it was an improvement. And all it took was a series, just a single fall of the hammer and out a spinning wheel, and your flint lasted a lot longer, and you'd have a very more efficient firearm. That was a pattern that lasted 200 to 300 years, and there weren't any improvements until we got to the percussion cap. So this is a trapper model. It's from Traditions. It's a kit that we put together. It is a replica of a whole bunch of different kinds of guns. It really doesn't, it's not really a replica of one particular gun. It's got a stock on it with this hump right here, which is kind of reminiscent of a dueling pistol. It's got a front end and stock and half stock, kind of like a Kentucky pistol, or more likely more of a Hawken pistol type style. So it's kind of a aggregation of several different styles all into one, but it does prove the point, or provide an example for what a flintlock is all about. So let me load this thing up. I'm going to put in probably about 40 grains of powder. It's a 50 caliber, so I got a 4.90 ball and a patch, and put a little priming powder in the pan, and we'll see if she goes. Got myself a little powder measure here. I'm putting in about 40 grains. This is double F GoX black powder, and as you guys in muzzle loading would know, you don't pour your powder measure or your powder flask and use that to measure and pour right down your barrel, because if there happens to be a spark or something and the powder catches on fire, you're holding on to a hand grenade. So I'm going to pour it into a powder measure, and it's set at 40 grains. See if I can get that to fill up. There we go. And then I'm going to put the 40 grains down the barrel. I'm going to make sure the barrel's not pointed at my face. I'm going to put this down the barrel. If anything goes off, it's going to hurt my hand, but it's not going to hurt anything beyond that. And then we're going to put a lubricated patch on top, and then push it down with the ball. So I've got a pretty light load. I'm shooting just 40 grains of black powder, nothing that's really terribly powerful. Going to use my ball starter, keep this away from my face. I don't have a pistol stand, that would have been nice. Keep this away from my face. Start this ball in, get it going. Pull out the ramrod, sink her down, compress it just a little bit on the other end, down on the bottom. So now my bullet's seated against the powder, my patch and ball. This is called my pan. This is where I put my priming powder, and this is a little powder priming powder container. Nothing's going to go off here, so I can go ahead and put just a little bit of this priming powder. This is 4F black powder from GoX. So I'm going to fill that pan. Overdid it a little bit. It's going to be tricky in the wind. Fill that pan, and I'm going to cover the pan in what's called the frizzen. So the frizzen is what causes the spark when the flint hits it. So now I've got a pan that had this primed, and frizzen that's down and where it's going to receive and strike against, or the flint's going to strike against it, and hopefully it'll light that powder in the pan, which will then light the main powder charge through the touch hole, and then my projectile goes downrange. So that's the basics of a flintlock design. Misfires were I wouldn't say common necessarily, but not uncommon. I guess I could say that. The better you were at positioning your flint, staying out of wet weather, the more reliable your firearm was. But it was a system that was as advanced as it got for about 250 to 300 years. So we're going to see if we can get this baby to go off, and see what a flintlock looks like. Okay, here we go. It ain't going. That scared me.
I went.
I was just thinking it wasn't going to go, so I just yanked on it. That's going to be awkward looking on film because I wasn't even trying.